Hi, this is Lynn Oz, and I have Benjamin Baruch, author of The Day of the Lord is at Hand. And with us tonight is also Jeffrey Nyquist, and he has been a columnist for World Net Daily and is the author of several books, including The New Tactics of Global War. And that was co-authored with Benjamin Baruch, who I just introduced and we have here with us tonight as well. And we're going to have some really, really interesting discussions here tonight. And it has to do with signs that war is coming this year. And we're going to discuss, how all of these signs that are indicating war is coming this year, how it all plays out, and how we can be certain that this is a great possibility, not just because of all the things we're seeing unfold prophetically in the news and in the world today, but what's going on in the world and information provided by sources who are in the know. And Jeff Nyquist will be sharing some of that with you. So make sure that you sit tight and listen, because I guarantee this is information that you definitely do not want to miss. So Jeff, thank you for joining me tonight. It's great to have you. Benjamin, thank you. I'm excited and can't wait for my listeners to hear what all that you gentlemen have to share.
All right, Benjamin, maybe we should get started. I have an item I could hit you up with, which is interesting. It's a news item from the Washington's blog from 2012, and it says Russia is sitting on trillions of carats of diamonds, enough to supply the global diamond market for 3,000 years. And I put that out there because it's one sign of Russia preparing for war back in 2012, but we're seeing more of that recently. Maybe you could tell the listeners what it means to you.
Well, the communist nations, not just Russia alone, but China and the other their satellite powers, have been preparing for eventual conflict with the West, and by the West I'm referring to NATO and primarily the United States, for many years. And one of the things you do in preparation for war is you stockpile the necessary resources, raw materials, as well as investment assets that will retain their value in terms of things like diamonds, gold, and the communist powers have been accumulating pretty much as they can acquire of these assets, which also really kind of tips the hand of the players that they are expecting the dollar-centered financial system to not be a safe place to preserve wealth.
Yeah, in fact, if I may interrupt, Russia and China are trying to collapse the dollar, aren't they?
Well, absolutely. They have now essentially completed the Shanghai Cooperative, which is also a financial clearing system that allows countries to do international bank settlement clearing outside of the Western European and American-based Bank of International Settlements, which primarily only clears international transactions in U.S. dollars. And so, yes, they are very much working to frustrate and undermine the all of the supports for the Western-based petrodollar system, because any student of economics understands the petrodollar, the U.S. Controlled financial system in the West, provides a huge subsidy to the United States economy, a huge subsidy and almost an interest-free financing source for the U.S. federal deficit, which is being financed through the trade deficit cash flows, and thereby all of our trading partners are in effect subsidizing or financing the U.S. military budget. And so, the enemies of America are clearly tired of an arrangement that only benefits the U.S., and for these reasons, yes, they're doing everything
they
can
I would say
to undermine.
It doesn't only benefit the U.S. because speaking of, I knew a fellow who was an economic advisor. I know of a fellow who was an economic advisor to the Prime Minister of Australia. We have a mutual friend in common, and he explained to my friend that Australia knows that that supporting the dollar is like a subsidy to the U.S., but they need the U.S. to defend them, and they think it's a good deal. And he
Well, there's
said
a
something
quid pro
else.
quo.
Yeah,
Clearly, the trading
yeah,
partners
yeah.
were aware of the cost of the program, and they participated willingly for the U.S. political and military support that they received. And, Jeff, the cost of the dollar subsidy program in prior years, when it began in the 1970s and the 1980s, it was a relatively modest level of subsidy payments in terms of the true inflation or debasement rate of the currency. But over the last 10 years since the '08 financial crisis, we've been running trillion-dollar deficits. And so the debasement cost of this subsidy program has really gone through the roof, and the value of the benefit being received by our trading partners has also shrunk accordingly. So, yeah, it's a deal that doesn't make any sense in the current world, and therefore it's not going to continue for much longer.
Well, it wouldn't make sense if the U.S. lost a war against China or North Korea or Russia.
No, it wouldn't.
And see, this is what we're seeing starting to develop now. I think everybody has followed the news. What President Trump has said, that his button is bigger than Kim Jong-un's button, right? And it works better. There's been a kind of war of words between the President of the United States and the dictator of North Korea. The North Koreans have been testing rockets and nuclear weapons, and now it's understood they have maybe as many as 30 nuclear warheads. They have ICBMs, maybe more than we realize. There's a lot of alarm in Washington, in Tokyo, in Seoul, South Korea. And it's like we're being goaded. And we have a president who I think is definitely able to be goaded. And there's this party, and some of my friends in Washington are among them, that really think we have to launch a preemptive strike on North Korea. And they're really gung-ho for it. I do not believe this is the right strategy. Because I believe with some of the famous statesmen of history that preemptive war is wrong, that war is a terrible thing, and you don't want to ever start it, even if you have what sounds like good reasons to start it. You do not want to be the aggressor in a war. You don't want to strike first. And there's a lot of evidence that we've seen that Russia and China are putting forces on the border. I should say, if people have missed the news items, one of them is that Russia has evacuated the civilian population on the Russian side of the Russian-North Korean border. They have a very small border together there. And Russia has moved missile launchers into there and troops. There were a number of news items last year. This started in April. There's even video footage on YouTube of Russian rail cars moving tanks and armored personnel carriers into the region. There is the stories that the Chinese have been moving mechanized divisions and other resources in large numbers of troops towards the North Korean border. This is not, I do not think, to support the United States against North Korea. Quite the contrary. It's to support their ally. It's come out recently that they are sneaking fuel to the North Koreans. They promised to cut things off. They said, "Oh, well, we'll help you get, North Korean control. We'll stop supplying them." No, they're still supplying them with weapons, and it's come out that they've been supplying North Korea with missiles. So North Korea is sort of it's a country that is working with the Russians and the Chinese to provoke us, to hurt us, to lure us into a battle. And right now, the balance of power after 8 years of Obama, we're weak. We haven't been training. Our military hasn't been training because they didn't have the money to train the way they used to. The numbers are down. The nuclear arsenal is very, it's been growing more and more obsolete over the years. In fact, Obama's first defense secretary, Robert Gates, said right after Obama was elected that we needed the reliable nuclear warhead program, or within a year our nuclear arsenal would be reliable. Well, we have yet to produce one of these new warheads, and that means our nuclear arsenal is more than 7 years past the expiration date, now more than 8 years past the expiration date. And this is a very serious matter because we haven't tested a nuclear weapon since I think 91 or 92. So this is very alarming what's happening. And Russia and China have been engaged in intensive military buildup recently with new classes of weapons. And so that's what we're seeing right now. But what also is alarming is the political events that are happening in our country, with the President of the United States under investigation for collusion with the Russians in the election. I'm very skeptical about these claims about the president. But isn't it interesting when the prospect of war with Russia is growing? And a U.S. Marine general said recently that war could be coming, a big war with Russia could be coming to his troops up in Norway, U.S. Marines, that suddenly the U.S. president is accused of collusion with that same country that would be our enemy. And the actual accusation, the dirty dossier, so-called, came from Russia, was probably invented in Russia by the Russian intelligence services. I smell a rat here. What do you think about that?
Well, it's almost surreal to watch the news in light of the understanding that we have of the Russian military strategy against the United States, which was outlined by a number of defectors, including Viktor Suvorov, and he wrote extensively in his book Spetsnaz, as you've noted on many occasions, that the Russian strategy, and I'm always tempted to call them the Soviets, because aside from a change in name, not much is really different inside communist Russia today. But in any event, their long-range strategy against the United States involved a very sophisticated series of moves that were designed to deceive the United States. First, we had the fake collapse of the Soviet Union, in which no communist leader was ever arrested for any crimes against the Russian people or against humanity. And then we had this war that occurred following the collapse of the Soviet Union, in which suddenly America was under attack by rogue terrorist elements, of course, who don't carry Russian military business cards or KGB business cards. They don't list on their resume that they went to the KGB academy, but suddenly America was at war with rogue terrorist elements, and we were bombing Al-Qaeda in Bora Bora in the mountains of Afghanistan, and we've been at war against the shadow terrorists for 16 years, completely diverting the focus of our military and our intelligence services from the main enemy actors that we face, which is Russia and China, to these rogue terrorist elements.
The real
and then,
existential
of course, the final phase being...
Yeah. Sorry.
Well, in the final phase of this overture period, as described by the Soviet defectors, being a period of scandal and of accusation and of attempting to discredit the leadership in the West of everything under the sun, including accusing people of being Russian agents or colluding with the Russians. And some of the accusations would be true, and other people would be completely innocent, just being framed by outright lies and propaganda created by the Russian intelligence services. And doesn't it sound like the news today?
Yeah, well, you mentioned Viktor Suvorov. He outlined in his book, Spetsnaz, written in the late 80s, he outlined that there were two things that were going to happen before World War III. And those two things, one of them was going to be what he called gray terror, which the West is attacked, as you described, by terrorists who have no apparent connection to Russia, but in fact they are mercenaries controlled by intermediaries. And their purpose is, as you said, to divert the intelligence and military assets of the U.S. away from the real existential threat, which is the Russian nuclear arsenal and the Chinese-Russian alliance. But the second element in this pre-war configuration, the second element is scandal. The KGB has been collecting compromising information on movie producers, politicians, businessmen, military officers, and so on for decades. And now we have one scandal after another for the last year, and with the president kind of being the central scandal about which we have a special counsel appointed Mr. Mueller to look into this matter. And it goes on and on. It never stops. It's kept alive. And the purpose of creating all this scandal is to discredit the leadership and the major figures in the United States and other Western countries on the eve of war, to create dissatisfaction and demoralize the American people. And we're seeing this too, which is, I'm hoping that's not what it is, but when you see these things, and then to kind of round things out, Chatham House, just for example, the Royal Institute of International Affairs in the UK, 18 months ago had a piece by Dr. Andrew Monaghan, and the title was Russian State Mobilization Moving the Country Onto a War Footing. It's about how Russia is moving itself towards a war footing. This is 18 months ago. Of course, moving a large country to a war footing takes many months. And when Russia and China have been building up for years now, and now both countries moving towards a war footing, we had the Canadian Defense Minister a couple of months after this talk about Canadian intelligence that Russia was secretly preparing for war against the United States. And now, of course, we had this Zapad exercise in September, which was this was a secretive Russian military exercise where they did this super flash mobilization of troops to the western borders of the Russian Federation, next to Finland and Norway and Poland and the Baltic states. And they moved lots of troops into Belarus above Ukraine. And it turns out, now it's come out, that in that exercise, they were rehearsing for bombing Amsterdam, NATO headquarters, and Germany, and invading Scandinavia, Poland, and the Baltic states, invading NATO. That's what the Russians were practicing. And this is really alarming because NATO is not really interested in attacking Russia, despite all the Russian propaganda and the people who would say that. We've got our own problems, and we certainly don't want a nuclear war because Russia's the most heavily armed. It has more, they admit that they have more nuclear warheads than we do, and they're newer, where ours are obsolete. And so this is where I'm coming from in this, and I think I'm very disturbed that Americans just don't know this, and it's not, people aren't understanding. And I would hope that if the president, he'd probably never listened to this, but if he was listening, please don't attack North Korea, because we're weak and they're strong, and North Korea I think is backed by Russia and China.
Well, I think that's clear that North Korea is essentially a satellite power, and every time there was a U.S. embargo or sanction action against North Korea, the Chinese government gave lip service, acknowledgement, and a pledge to abide by the sanctions, but over the many years, in every instance, they simply ignored the sanctions and continued to provide support to the North Korean regime, whether covertly or blatantly. This time is no different. But, Jeff, we should also mention to our audience that while the United States has virtually no anti-ballistic missile defenses that are capable of stopping a modern ICBM, let alone a rogue ICBM that might be launched by North Korea, Russia, on the other hand, has been building dual-purpose anti-ballistic missiles, which they called surface-to-air or anti-aircraft missiles. These have been dual-purpose systems going back many, many years.
Yes.
The S-300, S-400, and then the newest S-500 that is likely in deployment right now. These systems are capable of stopping incoming ICBMs, and they have something in the neighborhood of 12,000 ABMs in their country.
Yeah,
and we
10
have
to 12,000.
zero.
Yeah, Bill Lee, who's an expert on this in the United States, he estimated they had, in his 1997 book, the ABM Treaty Charade, that they had 10 to 12,000. And in, I think shortly before his death, I think it was in 2002 or 3, he wrote a piece in the Washington Times lambasting the Western media for depicting Russia's ballistic missile defense system as, run down and dilapidated. He basically scolded them, saying, no, this is not the truth. And this was years ago.
Anyone colluded with, if there was any organizations in the U.S. that were guilty of collusion with the Russians, whether by virtue of ignorance or hubris or treason, it would be the media that has so misrepresented the reality of military balance of power.
Yeah, there's the famous story that Vladimir Bukovsky, the famous Russian dissident, tells of after the collapse of the Soviet Union. He was in the archives of the Communist Party Soviet Union, and they were letting him see things, and he was actually smuggling documents out because they didn't know, how, they didn't know some of this modern computer technology. Scanners, they didn't really understand what a portable scanner was, and the librarian or the archivist there had this piece of paper that was covered in names front and back, and he held it up and he goes, "You won't be able to see this one." And Bukovsky said, "Well, what's that piece of paper?" He says, "That's all the media and newspaper people in the West that we control." There were, it was like the back and front page of a phone book. There were not just dozens of names. There were probably well over 100 names on this piece of paper. And of course, this is major media figures in the West. And of course, our news has been liberally salted with disinformation. And let me explain. There's a difference between propaganda and disinformation, because if somebody came on the TV and said, "Russia's great, America's awful," you would go, "Oh, that's propaganda," right? And you wouldn't believe it. Because if you're an American, you think, well, I'm for my country. I'm an American. I can't be against myself. But it's much more clever than that. Because what their propaganda does is they say Bush lied and people died, and they'll say something like the collapse of the Twin Towers. There were no airplanes. There was implosions in the building and whatever. Well, that stuff comes from people in Europe and France and Russia. A lot of that information, they're pushing that. There's a Russian general that went to Paris at one of the big meetings of the Truthers and gave a speech. He was one of the top generals of the Russian Federation. They have a vested interest in dividing us and turning us against our own country.
And Jeff, one of the things they push is that we are the superpower of the world, even though our equipment is antiquated and our nuclear arsenal is likely mostly obsolete at this point. Yeah. And Russia, the Russian Navy is a bunch of rusting junk. They can't even go to sea. The lone Russian aircraft carrier needs tugboats to rescue it because the engines keep breaking down. And they paint this picture of essentially a Tijuana type military capability when nothing could be further from the truth. And our analysts, it's almost like we wanted to be stupid, because the Russian military research facilities, they let the building exterior deteriorate. They don't paint the building.
Yes, that's right.
You have a building that looks like it's in disrepair. They don't do any landscaping. It's overgrown with weeds. It looks like a decrepit structure that's been abandoned on the outside. And on the inside of the building, they're developing state-of-the-art fifth-generation super technologies that are going to win this war in an hour. And we are literally, it's amazing how easily we were fooled. And not just recently, going all the way back to the beginning of the CIA in 1948. We got beat.
Yeah, excuse me. Absolutely right. There's a deception that goes on. When we heard that communism is dead, even though nobody killed it, and that they pulled down the hammer and sickle flag in Moscow, the reality is very different over there. And I think we have to treat with great reserve these claims. When you have someone like Angela Merkel as the Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel was a communist youth leader. She was part of the communist leadership apparatus in East Germany. Now she's the conservative Chancellor of the United Germany. You've got other problems in other former Warsaw Pact countries like Bulgaria, where for a number of years the prime minister was a person born in the Soviet Union, and the president of the country almost bragged that he had been an agent of the secret police, of the communist secret police. You had a Hungarian prime minister had to step down because it was discovered he had been not just an agent of the secret police, but an officer, an official of the communist secret police of Hungary. You had in Poland, which has made mighty strides to break from its control of the Russian agent networks, where you had the president of Poland in his plane downed on its way to the Katyn Forest memorial in what was it, 2011? No, 2010. Sorry, and of course that was loaded with most of the leading Polish leaders who knew that the Russians were still trying to control their country, and uh, Russia's desire to dominate Europe has not lessened at all, and China, just as China's desire to dominate the Pacific and Asia and East Asia.
They didn't suddenly get religion in the Kremlin at the time of the collapse. Hey Jeff, if I could, I think our readers would like to hear just a brief excerpts from our book, The New Tactics of Global War, that sort of paint a picture for the background of our discussion. And so let me just take a moment.
Yeah, and I might add, they can get The New Tactics of Global War at Amazon, and we really encourage people to buy the book because it contains stuff that keeps coming true. We talked about some of these things before they started to happen, and it's I've spent a lot of years researching in this area, and I've been concerned about us being in the place we are now. I have worried that we were going to get to this point, and I think we are on this point. That's why 2018 is going to be such a dangerous year.
It is indeed a dangerous year. And so let me just share a couple excerpts from The New Tactics of Global War. Starting with our discussion surrounding the collapse of the Soviet Union I guess it was 1989 that the process began. Educated opinion in the West accepted the collapse of the Soviet Union as spontaneous and authentic. The West embraced Russia's new democracy, and nothing could correct this misunderstanding. No criticism or warning from abroad could break the fever of the West's victory sickness. The greatest genius, the most passionate argument, even the most unanswerable logic could not sway them from their delusions, which would prove too deep-rooted and gratifying to ever be discarded. What was going to happen at the end of this chess game could not be prevented. Those who warned of a continuing communist threat were simply out of bounds. The belief that we still have an enemy is unacceptable to America's shopping mall paradigm and its hedonistic assumptions. America's willing blindness was appreciated by Kremlin strategists and sociologists who had studied American cultural changes during the 60s and 70s. Year after year, the KGB covertly promoted, through active measures, many of the social crises which occurred in America during those decades. They saw the weakness of America's commercialized society as worthy of exploitation to the fullest extent possible. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Iron Curtain, a new Iron Curtain descended when the old Iron Curtain came down. An Iron Curtain of denial and self-deception embraced willingly by the West. All political parties had something to gain. The peace dividend meant more welfare pork and less defense spending. So the left was satisfied. It also translated into economic exuberance and a climbing stock market. So the right was triumphant and self-congratulatory. The deception was perfect. Everyone was bought off emotionally and materially. The truth did not have one chance in a million. More than a quarter of a century has passed since the fall of the Berlin Wall. The vacuum of power which was created by the collapse of the Soviet Union has led the world rather than to an era of permanent prosperity and what was called the end of history at the time, but rather to a policy of self-deluded disarmament. Russia merely appeared to embrace democracy and a consumer-based economy. But nothing of the sort ever actually happened. Instead, Russia developed an entirely new class of weapons which today no other nation possesses and has now armed itself to the teeth. The early reports of the demise of the Soviet Union and the end of the communist threat now appear, at best, to have been greatly exaggerated.
Yes.
And, you know, it's an alarming report, and a lot of people would prefer to put their head in the sand because they simply have no concept of what do you do? How do we deal with the report that there truly is a communist threat and that our nation may be at war soon? Well, in the interest of keeping these programs in a manageable time period, we're going to end this program at part 1 here at the 30-minute mark, and we will pick up the reality of the communist threat to the United States of America in part 2, which will be also available on Lynn's program. And Jeff, I look forward to the second half of our program with you.
I do too, and I didn't realize our book was so excellent.
That was a well-written section, and I'm sure our listeners, if you get this book, you'll be really glad you did, because it's something you can share with the naysayers in your family, the naysayers at your church that are absolutely convinced nothing bad could ever happen to them. You know, bad things only happen to people on TV. They never happen to you, and they never happen to me. That's the mantra of the deceived American people. Well, the bad things that are out there are coming home to the United States of America, and most likely in the current year. So be sure to tune in for part 2, my friends. And thank you for your time.
Yes, everyone, be sure and tune in to part 2, because you're going to find out a lot more information that you didn't find out in this one. And it is information that is literally explosive and you do not want to miss. So be sure and be looking for part 2. It will be uploaded here very soon, probably the next video on my channel here. Thank you so much, and God bless you.